Picture this. Dr. Sarah Chen stands frozen behind the reinforced glass of the grizzly bear observation deck at Wilderness Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, watching something that makes her question everything she knows about animal behavior. Kodiak, a massive 800-pound grizzly bear, is carefully selecting stones from the creek bed that runs through his enclosure, carrying each one in his powerful jaws to the northeastern corner where he places them with surprising gentleness. The pile has grown to nearly 4 feet high over the past 3 weeks, and what started as curious behavior has become an obsession that's consuming every waking moment of the bear's life. He hasn't touched his food in 2 days, choosing instead to guard this mysterious stone monument with fierce determination. Visitors whisper and point, some laughing at what they assume is a quirky animal habit. But Sarah sees the intensity in Kodiak's dark eyes. This isn't play. This is purpose. The bear's massive frame trembles with exhaustion, yet he continues his work with the dedication of someone building something vital, something urgent. Little did Sarah know, Kodiak wasn't just stacking stones. He was desperately trying to prevent a disaster that could destroy everything she'd worked to build, and his frantic construction project was the only thing standing between the sanctuary and catastrophe. Let me take you back to where it all began. Sarah Chen had dedicated her entire adult life to understanding the complex emotional lives of rescued wildlife. After earning her PhD in animal psychology from UC Davis, she'd turned down lucrative research positions at prestigious universities to work at Wilderness Ridge, a 500-acre sanctuary nestled in the mountains of Northern California. The facility housed 43 animals: bears, wolves, mountain lions, and various smaller creatures, all of them survivors of human cruelty, illegal captivity, or environmental disasters. Sarah's reputation for rehabilitating seemingly hopeless cases had earned her recognition from conservation groups worldwide. But more importantly, it had earned her the trust of creatures that had every reason to fear humans. Kodiak had been her greatest success story. The enormous grizzly arrived 5 years ago as a traumatized 2-year-old cub, confiscated from an illegal exotic pet operation in Nevada where he'd been kept in a dog crate barely large enough for his growing body. When Sarah first met him, he was malnourished, terrified of human contact, and displayed repetitive stress behaviors that broke her heart. She'd spent months earning his trust, speaking to him in soft tones during feeding times, never making sudden movements, always respecting his space. Gradually, Kodiak had blossomed into a magnificent example of his species, intelligent, playful, and surprisingly gentle despite his intimidating size. His enclosure was Sarah's pride and joy, 3 acres of naturalistic habitat complete with a flowing creek, mature pine trees, rocky outcroppings for climbing, and a large heated den for winter hibernation. She'd personally overseen every detail of its construction, ensuring it met the highest standards for animal welfare, while providing visitors with educational opportunities about grizzly behavior and conservation. The morning sun filtered through the towering redwoods that bordered the sanctuary, casting dappled shadows across Kodiak's domain as Sarah made her routine rounds, clipboard in hand, checking off items on her daily inspection list. Everything had been perfectly normal until 3 weeks ago, when Sarah noticed the first stone. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Sarah first observed Kodiak's unusual behavior. She was conducting her weekly behavioral assessment, noting his eating patterns, activity levels, and social interactions with the sanctuary's other bears in adjacent enclosures, when something caught her attention. Kodiak was standing in the shallow creek, his massive head lowered as he carefully examined the smooth river rocks that lined the bottom. This wasn't entirely unusual. Bears often forage in water and manipulate objects with their mouths. But there was something different about his focus, something deliberate about the way he was selecting specific stones. After several minutes of careful consideration, Kodiak chose a rock roughly the size of a cantaloupe and carried it across his enclosure to the northeastern corner, where he placed it against the concrete barrier that separated his habitat from the sanctuary's service road. Sarah made a note in her observation log, thinking it was perhaps a new form of enrichment behavior, something to add variety to his daily routine. The next morning, there were 3 stones in the corner. By the end of the week, the pile contained dozens. Sarah tried to dismiss her growing concern, reminding herself that bears were naturally curious creatures who often engaged in seemingly purposeless activities. But this felt different. Kodiak's behavior had become methodical, almost ritualistic. He would wake before dawn, spend the entire day selecting and transporting stones, then curl up next to his growing pile to sleep, as if guarding it from invisible threats. The other staff members at the sanctuary had begun to notice too. Jake Morrison, the head groundskeeper who'd worked with wildlife for over 30 years, mentioned during their weekly staff meeting that he'd never seen anything quite like it. Dr. Patricia Williams, the sanctuary's veterinarian, suggested they monitor the situation closely but avoid intervening unless Kodiak showed signs of physical distress or self-harm. Sarah wanted to believe this was just an unusual but harmless behavioral quirk, but something in her gut told her otherwise. There was an urgency in Kodiak's movements, a desperation that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. When she approached the corner of his enclosure to get a closer look at his construction project, the bear's reaction sent chills down her spine. Kodiak had always been gentle with Sarah, often approaching the fence when she called his name, and sometimes even allowing her to scratch his massive head through the reinforced mesh during feeding times. But when she walked toward his stone pile, the 800-pound grizzly positioned himself between her and his construction, rising to his full height, nearly 10 feet tall on his hind legs, and releasing a warning growl that resonated through her chest like thunder. The message was clear: stay away from the stones. Sarah stepped back immediately, her heart pounding as she tried to process what she'd just witnessed. In 5 years of working with Kodiak, he had never shown aggressive behavior toward her or any other staff member. The bear's protective stance over his stone pile suggested this wasn't random behavior. It was something he considered vitally important, something worth defending. That evening, Sarah found herself staying late at the sanctuary, sitting on the observation deck in the growing darkness, watching Kodiak's silhouette as he continued his work by moonlight. The rhythmic sound of stones being placed echoed through the quiet forest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial, something that would explain this sudden and intense behavioral shift. Her phone buzzed with a text from her colleague Dr. Martinez at the university. "Any updates on your Grizzly's construction project? The video you sent has the whole department talking." Sarah had shared a brief clip of Kodiak's behavior with a few colleagues, hoping someone might offer insights into what she was witnessing. So far, none of the experts she'd consulted had seen anything similar. As she watched Kodiak carefully position another stone, adjusting its placement with surprising precision, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would set up continuous monitoring cameras to document his behavior patterns, and she would start looking for answers beyond conventional animal psychology. Something was driving Kodiak to build this mysterious structure, and she was determined to understand what it was before it was too late. The escalation began the following Monday morning when Sarah arrived to find Kodiak's behavior had intensified dramatically. Where he had previously spent a few hours each day working on his stone pile, he was now dedicating nearly every waking moment to the project. The pile had grown to over 5 feet in height and was beginning to spread along the concrete barrier, creating what looked almost like a primitive wall. More concerning was Kodiak's physical condition. Despite the autumn weather being perfect for building up fat reserves before winter hibernation, the bear had barely touched his food over the weekend. His ribs were beginning to show through his thick fur, and dark circles had formed around his eyes, suggesting he wasn't getting adequate sleep. Sarah watched in alarm as Kodiak stumbled while carrying a particularly heavy stone, his massive frame shaking with exhaustion. During the sanctuary's morning staff meeting, Sarah presented her findings to the team. "He's lost approximately 40 pounds in the past 2 weeks," she explained, pointing to the weight chart on her tablet. "His food consumption has dropped to less than 30% of normal intake, and the continuous monitoring cameras show he's averaging only 3 hours of sleep per night." Dr. Williams frowned as she reviewed the data. This level of behavioral obsession combined with rapid weight loss and sleep deprivation suggests we're dealing with something more serious than unusual enrichment behavior. "I recommend we intervene before his health deteriorates further." Jake Morrison nodded in agreement. "I've been working with bears for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like he's been programmed to build that pile, no matter what it costs him physically." Sarah felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Everything her colleagues were saying made logical sense. They needed to protect Kodiak's health by stopping his compulsive behavior, but something deep in her intuition screamed that interrupting his work would be a mistake they'd all regret. The following day, the sanctuary's board of directors made the decision for her. After receiving reports about Kodiak's deteriorating condition and concerns from visitors about the bear's obvious distress, they authorized immediate intervention. A team from the state wildlife department would arrive that afternoon with tranquilizer equipment and heavy machinery to remove the stone pile and, if necessary, temporarily relocate Kodiak to a holding facility until his behavior normalized. Sarah spent the morning in agonized preparation, trying to convince herself that forcing Kodiak to abandon his project was the right decision. She drafted detailed notes for the intervention team, explaining the bear's history, his usual temperament, and the progression of his stone-stacking behavior. But as she watched him through the observation window, carefully selecting each rock with the focus of a master craftsman, she couldn't escape the feeling that they were about to make a terrible mistake. The intervention team arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. 3 wildlife officers with tranquilizer rifles, 2 heavy equipment operators with a bulldozer and excavator, and Dr. Reynolds, a specialist in abnormal animal behavior from the state university. Sarah met them at the sanctuary's main gate, her stomach churning as she led them toward Kodiak's enclosure. As they approached the northeastern corner where the stone pile now towered nearly 6 feet high and stretched 20 feet along the barrier, Dr. Reynolds whistled in amazement. I've read about repetitive behaviors in captive animals, but I've never seen construction on this scale. It's almost architectural in its precision. The wildlife officers began setting up their equipment while the heavy machinery operators assessed the best approach for dismantling the structure. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched Kodiak's reaction to the unusual activity around his territory. The bear immediately positioned himself between the approaching humans and his stone construction, his massive frame tense with protective alertness. When the first bulldozer rumbled to life, Kodiak released a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Sarah had never heard him make a sound like that. It was primal, desperate, filled with a terror that made her blood run cold. That's not normal defensive behavior, Dr. Reynolds observed, his voice tight with concern. That's the sound of an animal who believes he's fighting for survival. The first tranquilizer dart struck Kodiak in the shoulder, and Sarah watched in horror as the magnificent bear staggered but refused to retreat from his position guarding the stones. Even as the sedative began taking effect, he continued to place his massive body between the machinery and his construction project, swaying on his feet, but refusing to abandon what had become his life's work. When Kodiak finally collapsed, Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. As the bulldozer began pushing the carefully placed stones aside, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were destroying something vital, something that might have been the key to understanding not just Kodiak's behavior, but something much more important than any of them realized. The aftermath of the intervention haunted Sarah for weeks. Kodiak had awakened from the sedation confused and clearly distressed by the destruction of his stone pile. He spent the first 3 days after the removal pacing frantically around the corner where his construction had stood, occasionally releasing heartbreaking vocalizations that sounded almost like crying. Gradually, he'd begun eating again and his sleep patterns had normalized, but something essential seemed to have gone out of him. The spark of intelligence and purpose that had driven his behavior was gone, replaced by a listless depression that worried Sarah more than his previous obsession. The sanctuary's board was satisfied with the intervention's success. Kodiak was physically healthy again, his behavior had returned to normal patterns, and visitor complaints had stopped. But Sarah couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that they'd missed something crucial. She found herself returning to the monitoring footage again and again, studying hours of video, showing Kodiak's methodical construction process, looking for clues they might have overlooked. It was during one of these late-night review sessions that she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. In the background of several videos, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, hairline cracks had begun appearing in the concrete barrier where Kodiak had been building his stone pile. The cracks were subtle at first, almost invisible, but over the 3-week period of his construction project, they had steadily grown larger and more numerous. Sarah immediately called Jake Morrison and Dr. Williams to review the footage. As the three of them studied the time-lapse progression of the crack formation, a terrifying possibility began to emerge. "Those aren't expansion cracks," Jake said, his voice grim as he pointed at the screen. "That concrete is failing under some kind of pressure." "The question is, pressure from what?" Dr. Williams pulled up the sanctuary's construction blueprints on her laptop. "According to these plans, there's a natural gas pipeline that runs directly underneath that section of the barrier. It's part of the main line that supplies the entire valley." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. Kodiak wasn't building randomly. He was building directly over the point where the pipeline runs underneath the enclosure. And these cracks suggest the pipeline might be compromised. The three of them stared at each other in stunned silence as the pieces fell into place. Kodiak's urgent, obsessive behavior hadn't been a psychological disorder. It had been a desperate attempt to create a barrier over what his incredible senses had detected as a dangerous gas leak. Bears had far superior hearing and smell compared to humans, capable of detecting subsonic vibrations and chemical traces at concentrations humans couldn't perceive. While they'd been focused on treating his abnormal behavior, Kodiak had been trying to save everyone at the sanctuary from a potential explosion. The emergency response was swift and overwhelming. Within 2 hours of Sarah's discovery, the county hazmat team, fire department, and gas company engineers had descended on Wilderness Ridge. Using specialized detection equipment, they confirmed what Kodiak had somehow known for weeks. The high-pressure natural gas main running beneath his enclosure had developed multiple fractures, likely due to recent seismic activity in the region. Gas had been slowly leaking into the soil, creating a dangerous accumulation that could have ignited from any spark: a visitor's cigarette, a vehicle backfire, even static electricity. The evacuation order came at sunset. All 43 animals were loaded into transport vehicles and relocated to partner facilities throughout the state, while emergency crews worked around the clock to repair the damaged pipeline. The sanctuary's buildings were cleared of all personnel, and a half-mile exclusion zone was established around the gas leak site. As Sarah helped load Kodiak into the specialized transport trailer that would take him to a temporary home at the Oakland Zoo, she found herself apologizing to the massive bear who had tried so desperately to protect them all. "I'm sorry we didn't listen," she whispered through the trailer's ventilation slots. "I'm sorry we didn't understand what you were trying to tell us." Kodiak looked at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw forgiveness there. The gas company's investigation revealed that the pipeline failure could have resulted in an explosion with a blast radius of over 200 yards, easily large enough to destroy most of the sanctuary's facilities and kill anyone in the immediate area. The fractures had been caused by subtle ground shifts from a series of minor earthquakes that had occurred throughout the summer, seismic activity so slight that human instruments had barely registered it. But Kodiak's sensitive paws, pressed against the ground as he walked his territory daily, had felt every tremor, every shift in the earth that was slowly compromising the pipeline's integrity. The story spread rapidly through social media and news outlets, transforming from a simple wildlife behavioral puzzle into a testament to animal intelligence and environmental awareness. Videos of Kodiak methodically building his stone barrier were viewed millions of times, with comments from viewers around the world expressing amazement at the bear's prescient behavior and shame at humanity's failure to recognize his warning signs. Dr. Reynolds, the animal behavior specialist who had overseen the intervention, published a detailed paper about the case in the Journal of Applied Animal Psychology, arguing for a fundamental shift in how behavioral scientists approach unusual animal activities. "We must consider the possibility," he wrote, "that animals are responding to environmental stimuli we cannot perceive, rather than assuming that unfamiliar behaviors are automatically problematic." 3 months after the pipeline repair was completed, Sarah stood once again at the observation deck of Kodiak's enclosure, watching the magnificent grizzly explore his restored habitat. The northeastern corner where he had built his stone barrier was now marked with a small memorial plaque that read, "In recognition of Kodiak, whose wisdom protected us all." The bear had shown no interest in resuming his construction project since returning home, apparently satisfied that the danger had passed. The sanctuary's reopening had attracted visitors from around the world, all eager to meet the famous psychic bear who had predicted a disaster. But Sarah knew the truth was both simpler and more profound than psychic abilities. Kodiak had simply been paying attention to his environment in ways that humans, with their reliance on technology and dismissal of animal intelligence, had failed to do. As she watched Kodiak peacefully foraging along the creek, selecting smooth stones to examine before setting them back in the water, Sarah reflected on everything the experience had taught her about listening to the animals in her care. She'd spent decades studying their behavior, but it had taken nearly losing everything to realize that sometimes the most important communications were the ones that seemed most incomprehensible. The sanctuary had implemented new protocols based on Kodiak's case. Any unusual, sustained behavioral changes would trigger immediate environmental assessments using both technological instruments and careful observation of what the animals might be perceiving that humans were missing. Other wildlife facilities around the world had adopted similar approaches, recognizing that their animals might serve as early warning systems for dangers that traditional monitoring might overlook. 1 year later, Wilderness Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary had become a model facility for animal-human cooperation in environmental monitoring. The Kodiak Protocol was being implemented at zoos and sanctuaries across 3 continents, and Sarah found herself traveling internationally to speak about the importance of treating animal intelligence as a resource rather than a mystery to be suppressed. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Sarah's daily routine. Each morning, as she made her rounds through the sanctuary, she spent extra time at each enclosure, not just observing the animals' health and behavior, but listening, really listening, to what they might be trying to tell her about their world and hers. Kodiak had taught her that wisdom comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important messages arrive not through words or technology, but through the patient, desperate actions of a creature trying to protect those he loves, even when they don't understand what he's trying to say. The bear who had once stacked stones in urgent warning now spent his days in peaceful contentment, secure in the knowledge that his message had finally been heard. And Sarah had learned that sometimes the greatest act of scientific discovery is simply recognizing that the animals we care for might understand things we do not, and having the humility to pay attention when they try to share that knowledge with us. If you've ever witnessed unusual animal behavior that seemed to defy explanation, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Sometimes our animal friends are trying to tell us something important, and sharing these stories helps us all become better listeners. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of animal intelligence and the remarkable ways wildlife continues to surprise and teach us. Until next time, remember that wisdom comes in all sizes, even when it weighs 800 pounds and speaks through stones.